The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the desert sand, each revolution carrying Sarah further from everything she had ever known. The morning sun blazed mercilessly overhead as she clutched the worn leather seat, her knuckles white against the cracked surface. Behind her lay the settlement where she had been nothing more than a burden, a mouth to feed in a household already stretched thin. Ahead waited a fate she could barely comprehend. Her brother's words still echoed in her mind. A peace treaty, he had called it, a necessary sacrifice for the good of all. She would marry the Apache chief, cementing an alliance that might spare their small settlement from further raids. What he had not said, but what Sarah understood with painful clarity, was that she was expendable. At 23, unmarried and considered plain by the harsh standards of frontier life, she had become a convenient offering. The desert heat pressed against her face like a furnace, but inside her chest, fear ran cold as winter streams. Stories of Apache warriors filled her childhood memories, tales of painted faces and blood-curdling war cries. Now she would live among them, bound to their leader by vows spoken in desperation rather than love. As this story unfolds in the blazing desert heat, I'm curious where in the world you're listening from right now. Are you somewhere warm like our characters? Or perhaps finding comfort indoors while Sarah faces her uncertain journey? The wagon lurched over a particularly rough patch of ground, jolting Sarah from her dark thoughts. Soon, very soon, she would meet the man who would determine the rest of her days. She closed her eyes and tried to find courage in the vast, unforgiving landscape that would soon become her home. The Apache village emerged from the desert like a mirage, scattered dwellings of hide and wood nestled against red canyon walls. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as curious faces turned toward the approaching wagon. Children with dark, intelligent eyes peered from behind their mothers, while warriors stood with crossed arms, their expressions unreadable as carved stone. The wagon creaked to a halt in the center of the settlement, dust swirling in golden clouds around the wheels. Sarah remained frozen on the wooden seat, unable to make her legs obey the simple command to step down. This was not how she had imagined arriving at her new home, trembling like a rabbit before a gathering of eagles. Then he appeared. Chief Iana moved with the fluid grace of water flowing over rock, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. Sarah had expected war paint and feathers, the savage imagery that filled her people's fearful stories. Instead, she found herself looking into the weathered face of a man who bore the weight of leadership in the careful lines around his dark eyes. His hair, streaked with early silver, was pulled back with a simple leather cord. No ornamentation marked his status save for the quiet authority in his bearing. He approached the wagon with measured steps, his gaze meeting hers directly. Sarah braced herself for harsh commands or cold indifference. Instead, Chief Iana extended his hand toward her, palm upward in a gesture of assistance rather than demand. "You are welcome here," he said in carefully practiced English, his voice carrying the warmth of distant thunder. His eyes held no anger, no triumph over a captured prize. Instead, she glimpsed something unexpected, a deep, abiding kindness that made her chest tighten with confusion. Sarah's new dwelling stood at the village's edge, a carefully constructed shelter of buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles. The interior surprised her with its spaciousness and the intricate patterns woven into hanging blankets that divided the space into private areas. Chief Iana had provided her with this sanctuary, explaining through gestures and halting English that she would remain undisturbed until she felt ready to join their community fully. The first morning brought a parade of women bearing gifts, soft doeskin clothing to replace her rough settler dress, beaded moccasins that whispered against the earth, and baskets filled with unfamiliar foods. An elderly woman named Takala appointed herself Sarah's teacher, patiently demonstrating how to prepare the bitter root coffee that the tribe favored and showing her which plants could be gathered for medicine. Sarah's attempts at basic Apache words brought gentle laughter from the children who gathered around her dwelling each afternoon. They seemed fascinated by her pale skin and light hair, reaching out with careful fingers to touch the strange textures. Their innocent curiosity felt less threatening than the guarded politeness of the adults, who watched her with eyes that held generations of mistrust toward her people. Chief Iana visited each evening, always stopping a respectful distance from her door. He would ask about her comfort in his careful English, his concern evident in the way he studied her face for signs of distress. When she struggled to express her needs, he listened with infinite patience, never showing frustration at her halting attempts to communicate. One night, as shadows lengthened across the desert floor, Sarah found courage to ask the question that had haunted her since arriving. "When will we be married?" she whispered. Ayana's expression grew thoughtful. When you choose to, he replied simply, his words carrying a promise she had never dared hope for. The days began to blur together in a rhythm Sarah had never known in her previous life. She woke with the sun and learned to grind corn with the other women, her soft hands gradually developing calluses that spoke of honest work. The Apache women accepted her growing competence with nods of approval, though their conversations still flowed around her like water around a stone. Chief Ayana appeared each morning to check on the village's welfare, his presence both commanding and gentle. Sarah found herself watching for him from her doorway, noting how he listened to every concern brought before him, how he remembered each child's name, how his shoulders carried the weight of every decision that affected his people. One afternoon, a young warrior brought news of cattle thieves near the eastern border. Sarah watched as Ayana's expression darkened with the burden of leadership. The settlers who had sent her here as a peace offering continued to test that fragile truce, pushing their cattle onto Apache hunting grounds and claiming ignorance when confronted. That evening, instead of his usual brief visit, Ayana lingered near her dwelling as twilight painted the sky in shades of copper and gold. He spoke of his father, who had died defending their ancestral lands, and of the difficult balance between protecting his people and maintaining peace with the encroaching settlers. His voice carried a weariness that made Sarah's heart ache with unexpected sympathy. "You must think me weak," he said quietly, "for choosing diplomacy over warfare." Sarah surprised herself by stepping closer. "I think you brave," she replied, her words barely above a whisper. "Takes more courage to build bridges than to burn them." Something shifted in Ayana's dark eyes, a recognition that perhaps this arrangement might offer more than either had dared hope. The first Apache words Sarah learned were those for water, food, and thank you, but it was the language of gestures that spoke more clearly between her and Ayana. When she struggled with the intricate beadwork that Takala insisted she master, he would sit nearby in comfortable silence, carving smooth pieces of wood into children's toys while she worked. His presence had become a source of unexpected comfort rather than the fear she had originally felt. A crisis tested her growing acceptance within the tribe when young Nailnish fell gravely ill with fever. The medicine woman's remedies seemed to have little effect, and desperation filled the child's mother's eyes. Sarah remembered her own mother's treatments for similar ailments, knowledge passed down through generations of settler women. With trembling hands, she prepared willow bark tea and applied cool compresses, staying by the boy's side through 2 long nights while his fever raged. When Nailnish finally opened his eyes, weak but alive, the gratitude in his mother's face spoke louder than any words could have. The barrier of suspicion that had surrounded Sarah began to crumble like desert stones weathered by wind and time. As winter approaches in our story, bringing both challenge and healing, I'd love to know what season you're experiencing where you are right now. Are you bundling up for colder weather? Or perhaps enjoying spring warmth as Sarah learns to find her place in this new world? Ayana found her that evening, sitting exhausted but peaceful outside her dwelling. "You have given my people something precious," he said softly. "Hope that our 2 worlds might truly find peace." Sarah looked into his eyes and realized that somewhere between fear and acceptance, she had begun to care deeply about this man and his tribe. Winter's first breath swept across the desert, bringing with it a chill that seemed to settle into Sarah's bones. The nights had grown longer and colder, but she no longer faced them alone. Takala had quietly moved some of her belongings into Sarah's dwelling, a gesture that spoke of acceptance more clearly than words ever could. The elderly woman's presence brought comfort during the long, dark hours when homesickness threatened to overwhelm her newfound sense of belonging. Ayana's visits had become a cherished part of each evening. He would arrive as the cooking fires began to flicker to life across the village, carrying with him stories of his people's history and legends that painted the desert landscape with deeper meaning. Sarah found herself captivated not just by his words, but by the way his face grew animated when he spoke of the old ways, the reverence in his voice when he described the sacred places that dotted their ancestral lands. One evening, as snow began to dust the canyon walls like flowers scattered across a dark table, Ayana brought her a gift. It was a small carving, no larger than her palm, depicting 2 figures standing side by side beneath a star-filled sky. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail lovingly rendered in smooth, wood that felt warm against her skin. "I made this for you," he said quietly, his usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "It represents hope. Hope that 2 people from different worlds might find common ground under the same stars." Sarah cradled the carving against her chest, feeling her heart swell with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. For the first time since leaving her old life behind, She allowed herself to imagine a future filled with something more than mere survival. The attack came without warning on a morning when frost still glittered on the desert sage. Sarah woke to the sound of shouting voices and running feet, the peaceful rhythm of village life shattered by urgent cries of alarm. Through the hide walls of her dwelling, she could hear Ayana's voice calling out commands in rapid Apache, his tone carrying the weight of immediate danger. Takala burst through the entrance, her weathered face tight with worry. "Soldiers," she said in broken English, pointing toward the eastern ridge where dust clouds marked the approach of mounted men. "They come for you," the old woman added, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness that surprised Sarah with its intensity. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the blue uniforms cresting the hill. The U.S. cavalry had come to retrieve her, either believing she was being held against her will or deciding that the peace treaty her marriage represented was no longer worth maintaining. Through the dwelling's opening, she watched as Ayana positioned his warriors in defensive positions while trying to keep the approaching soldiers from interpreting their movements as hostile. The confrontation that followed would test everything that had grown between her and this community she had begun to call home. As the cavalry's leader rode forward demanding her return, Sarah stepped from her dwelling and walked steadily toward the center of the village. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps never faltered. Every eye in both camps fixed upon her as she moved to stand beside Ayana, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. In that moment, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life, declaring her loyalty not through words but through the simple act of where she chose to stand. The cavalry captain's voice carried across the tense silence like the crack of a whip. "Miss Sarah, you will come with us immediately. This savage arrangement ends today." The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable designed to strip away the dignity she had fought so hard to build in this place that had become more home than any she had ever known. Sarah felt Ayana tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt before forcing himself to stillness. She could sense the coiled energy of the Apache warriors surrounding them, men prepared to die rather than see their chief's honor insulted or their village threatened. The morning air crackled with the potential for violence that would destroy everything both communities had worked to build. "I am exactly where I choose to be," Sarah replied, her voice carrying farther than she had intended. The words seemed to hang in the desert air between the two opposing forces, a declaration that surprised even her with its firmness. She had not planned to speak, had not prepared any grand speech, yet the truth had emerged from some deep well of conviction she had not known existed. The captain's face darkened with anger and confusion. "You have been bewitched by these heathens," he spat. "Your family sent word that you are needed back home immediately." But even as he spoke the lie, Sarah could see the uncertainty flickering behind his bluster. He had expected to find a terrified captive, not a woman who stood with quiet dignity beside the man she was learning to love. Ayana stepped forward then, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "She speaks for herself," he said in carefully measured English. "As is her right. As is the right of any person who draws breath under Father Sky." The standoff stretched like a taut bowstring ready to snap. Sarah could feel the weight of two worlds pressing down upon her shoulders as she stood in the space between cultures that had known more conflict than peace. The cavalry captain's face had turned the color of desert stone, his authority challenged by a woman he had expected to rescue, not confront. Behind the soldiers, she glimpsed familiar faces from her old settlement. Her brother Thomas sat his horse with uncomfortable rigidity, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Beside him, the preacher who had blessed her departure now wore an expression of righteous indignation, clearly disapproving of her choice to remain among people he considered godless savages. "You have been deceived," the preacher called out, his voice carrying the fire and brimstone Sarah remembered from countless Sunday sermons. "These people worship false spirits and follow heathen ways. Return to Christian civilization before your soul is lost forever." His words struck at fears she had carried since childhood, doubts about salvation and eternal damnation that had been drilled into her from birth. For a moment, Sarah felt herself wavering. The familiar voices, the promise of returning to everything she had once known, tugged at her heart with unexpected force. But then she felt Ayana's presence beside her, steady as the canyon walls that sheltered his village. She remembered the kindness in Takala's weathered hands, the laughter of children who had accepted her without question, the reverence with which this community treated the natural world around them. "I have found my soul here," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "These people have shown me what it means to live with honor, to treat others with dignity regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. The captain's patience finally snapped like a dry branch underfoot. If you will not come willingly, then we will take you by force. You are still a citizen of the United States, and these savages have no legal claim over you. His hand moved to his sidearm, a gesture that sent ripples of tension through both groups of armed men. Sarah felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and blood would stain the desert sand that had become sacred ground to her. She thought of little Nailnish, now healthy and laughing with the other children, and of Takala's gentle hands teaching her the ancient ways of healing. She thought of Ayana's quiet strength and the way he had never once demanded anything from her except the freedom to choose her own path. Stepping forward, she placed herself directly between the two opposing forces. I am no longer the frightened girl you knew, she said, addressing her brother directly. I have found purpose here, found people who value me not for what I can provide them, but for who I choose to become. Thomas, you sent me here as a peace offering, expecting me to sacrifice my happiness for political convenience. Instead, I discovered something you never thought to seek: true partnership. As snow begins to fall in our story, creating a peaceful hush over this tense confrontation, I'm curious what time of day it is where you're listening from and whether you're somewhere cozy and warm as these events unfold. Her brother's face crumpled with something that might have been shame. The captain, seeing his justification slipping away, raised his weapon. But Ayana moved with fluid grace, his own hand empty and extended in a gesture of peace that somehow commanded more respect than any weapon ever could. The silence stretched like a held breath as Ayana stepped forward, his empty hands visible to all. He spoke directly to the captain, his words carefully chosen and delivered with the authority of a man who had led his people through countless challenges. We seek no conflict with you or your government. This woman came to us as part of a treaty your people requested. She has chosen to honor that agreement and has become a valued member of our community. Behind the cavalry, Sarah noticed several soldiers shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. Even they could see the absurdity of forcing a woman to abandon a life she had freely chosen to embrace. The captain's justification grew weaker with each passing moment, his authority undermined by Sarah's clear declaration of her own will. Thomas finally found his voice, though it cracked with emotion. Sarah, please. Mother is dying. She wants to see you before she passes. The words hit harder than any threat or religious condemnation could have. Sarah felt her resolve waver as memories of her mother's gentle hands and warm embrace flooded back. Here was a claim that trumped politics and treaties, a call to filial duty that struck at the very core of her being. Ayana turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting an understanding that made her heart ache. You must go to her, he said quietly. Some obligations transcend all others. His willingness to release her, even at this crucial moment, spoke of a love deeper than possession, a respect for her autonomy that no man from her former world had ever shown. But as Sarah looked into his face, she realized that her choice had already been made long ago. I will visit her, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill over. And then I will return home to my husband and my people. Spring returned to the desert with a gentleness that mirrored the peace now settled over Sarah's heart. She had indeed traveled back to the settlement, spending her mother's final days holding weathered hands and sharing stories of her new life. Her mother's blessing, whispered with her last breath, had sealed the rightness of Sarah's choice in ways that no treaty or ceremony ever could. Now, 3 months later, Sarah stood beside Ayana as the Apache marriage ceremony began under a canopy of desert stars. The ritual was nothing like the Christian weddings of her youth, but it spoke of commitments that ran deeper than spoken vows. Elder Takala wove their hands together with cords of braided leather, while the entire tribe formed a circle around them, their voices rising in ancient songs that seemed to call down blessings from the very heavens. The woman who had arrived in fear and desperation no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned that love was not about possession or control, but about choosing each day to build something beautiful together. Ayana had shown her that true partnership meant seeing and valuing each other's strengths while supporting each other through weaknesses. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah looked out over the faces surrounding them, faces that had once seemed foreign and frightening, but now represented the dearest of family. Children who called her aunt, women who shared their wisdom freely, men who had come to respect her contributions to their community's welfare. The peace treaty that had brought her here as a reluctant bride had evolved into something far more precious. A bridge between two worlds built on mutual understanding and respect. And at the center of it all stood her marriage to Ayana, a union that proved love could indeed transcend every boundary that prejudice and fear had tried to build.